This video is dedicated to my friends at Halton District School Board who will be revisiting their gender identity policy at tomorrow's board meeting. That, along with Alberta's transgender care policy discussion, makes this a great time to be having this conversation. Practically every school board in every province and state is having a discussion about social transition in school. And a reminder here, social transition is when a kid feels that they would like a name and pronoun that is different from their biological sex to be used in the classroom. And look, at least in Canada, every child has the right to do this because gender identity and expression are protected. If a child would like to be called Julia and use she/her pronouns, they are entitled to do so. Or at least they would be entitled to this if they were an adult. It gets slightly muddy because children do not make all decisions for themselves. They do make some decisions, but plenty of others are brokered alongside their parents. It's still legally unclear whether children can make this particular determination on their own. And that, of course, is the debate that we're having now. And I should acknowledge from the beginning that there are some people on the fringes who are literally arguing that no child should ever be allowed to socially transition, even with support from their parents. And I'm going to ignore these people because they are crazy hypocrites. They're yelling and screaming about parental rights that they feel they're not being granted, while at the same time fighting to extract agency and autonomy from other families who feel that this is the right decision for them and their child. The more reasonable debate that is taking place is whether parents ought to be informed when a transition at school takes place, whether or not they need to give consent for the process, or whether it can take place behind their backs with them not knowing at all. And there really is good debate to be had about whether or not parents should have to provide their consent or just be informed. But that's not the present discussion, because today most school boards have policies enshrining that social transition can be undertaken completely away from parents if a child requests it. Now look, I very much understand why a kid might not want to tell their parents. That was literally me. When I was that dysphoric child, I kept my journals on an encrypted floppy disk because I was so terrified of my parents finding out. Since schools were not even close to be accepting yet, I simply told nobody. I bottled it all up, it degraded my mental health, and it messed me up for decades to follow. And I'm so thankful that today things are different. It is a good thing that children can now bring this up at school. It's a good thing that they can share it with their friends, and I'm also glad that they can bring it up with their teacher if that's the pathway that they choose. We should acknowledge here that the concerns have been overblown because one side acts like teachers are tattling to parents the moment something is shared, which has not been proposed in any jurisdiction in Canada. And the other side ignores that while schools are giving students the option to withhold from parents, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're encouraging it for the child. Plenty of well-meaning administrators do encourage the child to tell their parents where doing so seems safe and reasonable. Because let's be honest, most people in this discussion are in agreement that the best outcome, the desired outcome, is that parents can be brought into the conversation and that the child can feel supported both at home and at school. So with that being said, why on earth would a child ever want to withhold a social transition from their parents? And this is where the conversation goes loopy, because what gets thrown around is that dangerous parents exist. That there are households where children may be emotionally or physically abused if they were to come out at home to their parents. And that risk is real. It is devastating and should be taken very seriously. It should be taken so seriously that in Ontario, like most jurisdictions, we have laws to protect children. See, the Child, Youth and Family Services Act is very clear when it specifies that, despite the provisions of any other act, if a person, including a person who performs professional or official duties with respect to children, has reasonable grounds to suspect one of the following, the person shall immediately report the suspicion and the information on which it is based to a society. And then the act goes on to list a whole bunch of reasons, including both suspected or anticipated physical or emotional abuse, neglect, or harm. And look, this reporting isn't optional. This is mandatory reporting to Children's Aid Society. It's been like this since the 1980s, and it's set up this way for good reason. A teacher or other professional doesn't know the extent of an abusive situation, and they are not in the position to find out. This is not their area of expertise, and they don't have access to the household. As such, they report it to the society so that it can be investigated in case a child is indeed suffering. Doesn't that seem reasonable? And yet, in this one case, and this one case only, we are not reporting to CAS, we are brokering a transition at school and hoping for the best. And this is what is so bonkers about how we are handling social transition in the classroom. Proponents first argue that social transition is not a big deal, that it's just something a kid is experimenting with and is far from permanent. But then they argue that it's a huge deal, because if the kid doesn't have this affirmation, then they may end up in a horrible mental state that might result in harm. So we must allow the child to proceed. And then they argue that we can't risk telling the parents because that might result in harm in the household, harm which, if real, could arise at any moment when the parent accidentally finds out about the child's identity. And what's so ludicrous about these talking points is that each of them are sometimes true, but they cannot all be true at the same time. Sometimes names and pronouns really are not a big deal. In my daughter's grade 9 class, she had someone who went by the name of Goose. I have to imagine that Goose did not select this name to cope with debilitating dysphoria. It certainly sounds a lot more like childhood creativity to me. And like most parents, if this was my kid, I would have a good laugh about my child's creativity. Live and let live. Kids will be kids. But in a case like this, you can't argue that the child literally needed affirmation as a life-saving measure. You really can't argue that harm would have befallen if this child's teacher did not call them Goose. We tell parents about bad marks and discipline stuff in school all the time. You really want me to believe that telling that particular family that their kid wants to be called Goose is going to result in harm? In a case like this, both the risk of telling the parents and the risk of not complying are relatively low. But there are other cases where deep dysphoria is at play. There are cases where children are in a very anxious state about their gender and where they are genuinely terrified about their parents finding out because they may literally be beaten, disowned, or abused. We should take that incredibly seriously. And what is our solution to that? Don't worry, kid. We'll just let you transition at school and hide this from your parents. Which just goes to show how much schools have not actually thought this through. It is a logistical nightmare. What happens if Jason, that's who I used to be named, is going by Julia in the classroom and then the parents show up at the office looking for Jason? The secretary knows I go by Julia. She calls into the classroom and asks for Julia to come to the office? Or now she says Jason? See, this gets complicated really, really quickly. What happens if the parents want to volunteer in the classroom? That's pretty common. Do they get denied with no explanation because the school knows they're hiding a transition from those particular parents? That may not go over very well. And won't all the other parents who are volunteering find out about the child? In order to affirm that particular child, they're going to need to know that Jason is now Julia. And for any of you who are parents, you know that parents talk. If you've watched Big Little Lies, moms talk. Isn't that creating a dangerous situation for this child? And in my case, both of my parents literally taught at my elementary and high school. How is the school going to protect me by making sure my identity wasn't known to them if I didn't want it shared? Or do I not get the same right to withhold from my parents because my parents happen to be employees of the board? That's a problematic precedent. What schools are missing is that they do have a legal obligation to allow individuals to identify and express however they wish. They do have a legal obligation to report even the possibility of abusive situations to ensure children are protected. But they do not have a legal obligation to shield a child's identity from parents, and any credible reason why one might be tempted to do so, in the service of protecting a child, of course, literally overlaps with their obligation to mandatorily report a dangerous situation. So here is what a sane school gender identity policy might look like. A child comes forward and says they want to transition at school. We want to respond positively and create a safe environment. So we tell the child this is something we'll talk to their parents about, that it's a big deal, and we want to know that they are supported at home. Perhaps their parents are already in the know. Great, then there's no problem if we mention it while we move forward. Or maybe the child tells us that they are not comfortable with their parents knowing. What a great chance to understand why. Are they embarrassed? I certainly was. I was deeply ashamed of myself and my feelings surrounding gender. If a kid feels that way, we could help them by getting adequate mental health support. And working to include parents in that conversation is probably a great step forward. Everyone will be better off in the end. Or in some cases, perhaps evidence of a bona fide risk of anticipated physical or emotional abuse rises to the surface. And when that happens, we should take it seriously and handle it the same way we've handled every other risk of physical and emotional abuse. We should handle it in alignment with our statutory obligation to report. We should do this in service to the child because it's going to come out sooner or later, and if there's an actual risk in that household, we need to help the child. Now, one final legal note. Some people have suggested that there's a provision in the Child, Youth and Family Services Act that creates space for teachers to not report matters of possible abuse when gender identity and expression are in the mix. This both doesn't make any sense and it's not an accurate reading of the statute. See, there is a section of the Act that says, a person directed in this part to make an order or determination in the best interest of the child shall consider any other circumstances of the case that the person considers relevant, including, and it then goes on to list all the usual protected identity classes, including gender identity and expression. And it also mentions considering the child's wishes as part of the determination. But this section isn't referring to teachers. Orders and determinations both have precise meanings in this act, and they refer exclusively to decisions made by a court, a board, a provincial director, or a commissioner. What this section is saying is that when a matter is brought forward for determination, for example in a hearing to remove a child from a household, the court will, as part of making an order on that decision, consider what the child wants and how the identity of that child relates to the outcome. It does not say that professionals like teachers who are untrained in mental health in this particular legislation have an out not to report real-life abuse simply because someone's transgender. Like, how would that even make any sense? Because if you read it that way, you would need to face the uncomfortable fact that the same clause also mentions the child's race and ancestry and linguistic heritage and creed and religion, etc. So, do we read it that we shouldn't report abuse if a child is Muslim? Or a child is born in Botswana? Or that the child speaks Hindi? Such an interpretation is ludicrous. The words order and determination appear 908 and 38 times respectively in this act. I reviewed every single one to check if any of the usages lended point towards decision-making done outside of the context of a society doing an investigation. And they're not even once. The act could not be clearer. When there's a possibility of abuse, we report this, and failure to do so puts children at risk and teachers in the line for possible legal consequences. We should be very concerned when school boards like Halton District School Board enshrine this into their policies. And yes, I'm aware that everybody's doing this right now in Ontario, but if everybody jumps off of a bridge, you know where I'm going with this. These boards are well-meaning, and I completely understand where they're coming from, but they are walking their staff into complex situations and giving very little guidance to them on how they should proceed. How do we hide this from parents? What happens when they find out? Will teachers themselves be liable for violating the Child and Youth Protection Act? We could have sane policies around this that recognize supporting children through the beginning of a social transition can be complicated. We could recognize that we need mental health supports involved, and that this is beyond the purview of what schools can reasonably handle. Or we can continue to ignore that complexity. We can continue to implement procedures that don't adequately support parents, teachers, or children, and we can pretend that we are doing so in the service of protecting children. Doing so is dangerous, but it also creates incredibly strong talking points for those who are genuinely against transgender people to push back strongly. And in the end, it hurts the very people that these boards are claiming that they want to protect. Some nuance would be good here. We could do that, and it would genuinely help to protect gender dysphoric children.